My name is Allison. I'm 28 years old, and my mother just casually told me she sold my childhood home to pay for my brother's wedding. The only problem is, she doesn't actually own it. The scent of cedar oil and old floor wax always felt like a hug. To anyone else, this house was just a 1920s craftsman with a slightly temperamental water heater. But to me, it was the only thing that still felt like my father. I stood in the hallway, catching my reflection in the mahogany-framed mirror. My shoulder-length blonde hair was a bit of a mess from a long day at the firm, and there was a smudge of graphite on my cheek from a blueprint I'd been obsessing over. As an architectural designer, I saw the world in lines and loads, but this house, it was my masterpiece. I'd spent 3 years and every penny of my savings to buy it back from the estate and restore it after Dad passed. "Allison, are you even listening?" The sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of my mother's heels on the hardwood shattered my peace. Diane walked into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk looking for a mouse. She lived in the guest suite, a space I'd renovated specifically so she wouldn't have to move into a tiny apartment. "I'm listening, Mom," I sighed, setting my laptop on the island. "You were saying Tyler found a venue?" "Not just a venue, the venue," Diane said, her voice rising with an artificial excitement that always made my skin crawl. She sat down, smoothing her perfectly pressed skirt. "The Grand Sterling. It's a literal tassel, Allison. It's what Tyler and Chloe deserve. But the deposit, it's astronomical." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Tyler was my younger brother, the golden child who had never met a bill he couldn't pass on to someone else. "If they can't afford a castle, maybe they should get married in a garden," I said, reaching for the kettle. Diane's face hardened. The mask of sweetness slipped just a fraction. "Don't be like that. You know how hard Tyler have been working at that startup." "He's been starting up for 3 years, Mom. He lives in a studio and spends his rent money on designer sneakers." "He is your brother," she snapped, then immediately lowered her voice, reaching across the counter to pat my hand. Her touch felt cold. "Allison, honey, you have so much. This house is worth a fortune now. I was thinking, if you just took out a small second mortgage or maybe a home equity loan, it would be a gift for Tyler, a way to show him you care." I pulled my hand away, the heat rising in my neck. "No, absolutely not. I didn't work 60-hour weeks to put this house in debt for a one-day party. Tyler needs to grow up." Diane didn't scream. She didn't even argue. She just stood up, her expression turning eerily calm. "I see. You've always been so territorial about this place, just like your father." She walked out of the room without another word. I stood there, the whistle of the kettle finally screaming into the silence, feeling a strange, cold shiver down my spine. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. It was only the beginning of her plan. The following week was a blur of steel beams and site inspections. I had a major project kicking off in Chicago, and the 3-day trip was exactly the breather I needed from the suffocating tension Diane had left in the kitchen. I assumed she was giving me the silent treatment, a favorite weapon of hers. I didn't mind. The silence of a hotel room was far better than the guilt-tripping she usually served with dinner. I landed back home on Thursday afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and coming rain, typical for a late spring day. As I pulled my SUV into my neighborhood, my mind was already on a hot bath and a glass of wine. I turned the corner onto my street, and my foot slammed onto the brake before my brain even fully processed what I was seeing. There, standing tall and mocking on my perfectly manicured front lawn, was a bright red and white sign, "Sold." The blood drained from my face so fast I felt dizzy. I stared at the sign, then at my house. My house! The white siding, the dark navy shutters I'd painted myself, the porch swing where Dad used to sit. A silver sedan I didn't recognize was parked in my driveway. A middle-aged couple was standing on my porch, peering through the windows of my living room. A man in a sharp suit, a real estate agent, was pointing toward the roof, gesturing wildly. I didn't even park properly. I left my car idling in the middle of the street, the door swinging open as I lunged out. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking with a mixture of terror and rage. "Get off my porch!" The couple jumped, startled. The agent looked down at his clipboard, then back at me with a professional, practiced smile that turned my stomach. "Can I help you? This is a private walkthrough." Private? I was at the bottom of the steps now, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I live here. I own this house." The couple exchanged a nervous, confused look. The agent chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. "I think there's a misunderstanding, miss. This property was sold on Monday. The closing is expedited. These are the new owners." "Sold?" I whispered, the word tasting like ash. "By who?" Before he could answer, the heavy oak door creaked open. My mother stood there wearing her hostess smile and holding a tray of lemonade. She looked at me, her eyes as cold as the ice in the glasses. "Allison, dear, you're back early. I was just showing the Millers around. Why don't you come inside and stop making a scene in the street?" She turned back to the couple, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial honeytone. "Forgive my daughter. She's always been dramatic. Change is hard for some people." I pushed past the agent, my boots thudding hard on the wood. I walked right up to her, my face inches from hers. I could smell her floral perfume, the same one she wore to my father's funeral. "What did you do, Mom?" I hissed. She didn't flinch. She just took a sip of her lemonade and looked past me at the sold sign. "It was done what was necessary, Allison. I did what a mother does. I took care of my family." I followed Diane into the kitchen, my kitchen. The sunlight streamed through the bay window I'd personally restored, mocking me with its warmth. The buyers and their agent stayed on the porch, murmuring in low, hushed tones. "Explain it," I said, my voice trembling. I gripped the edge of the marble island so hard my knuckles turned white. "Now, how did you put a sign on my lawn, Mom? I am the sole owner of this property." Diane set the tray of lemonade down with a deliberate, slow grace. She didn't look like a woman who had just committed a crime. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded, yellowing document. "Do you remember 3 years ago, Allison, right after your father died? You were a mess. You were traveling for work, trying to handle the estate, and you signed a power of attorney so I could help with the paperwork while you were away." I felt a cold drop of sweat slide down my spine. "That was for the estate, Mom, for Dad's car and his life insurance. It was temporary." "You never revoked it," she said, a sharp, triumphant glint in her eyes. "I checked with a friend who's a paralegal. It was broad enough. It gave me the right to act on your behalf regarding real estate holdings. So I acted." "You sold my home," I whispered. My stomach did a sickening flip. "You stole my life to pay for a party?" "It's not a party, Allison. It's your brother's future." Her voice finally cracked. The mask of the polite hostess shattered. "Tyler is finally settling down with a girl from a prominent family. Do you have any idea what it would do to his reputation if he had a budget wedding? He needs this. He's the man of the family now." The front door banged open. "Is it done? Is the deposit cleared?" Tyler walked in, looking exactly like the man Diane described, except his prominence was all smoke and mirrors. He wore a brand new designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Trailing behind him was Chloe, his fiancée, her phone already out, filming a video of my living room. "Oh my God, Tyler," Chloe chirped, ignoring me entirely.
If we knock out this wall, we could do a really cute getting ready montage here before we head to the Sterling. You're not knocking out any walls, I snapped, turning on them. Tyler, tell her to stop. Tell Mom she can't do this. Tyler had the decency to look at the floor for exactly 2 seconds before he shrugged. Look, Allie, Mom said you were cool with it. She said you wanted to help out. Besides, the money is already in the wedding escrow. The florist and the caterer are paid. You can't exactly get it back now. You took my money? I felt the air leave the room. Technically, the buyers paid a massive non-refundable deposit to secure the expedited closing, Diane added, smoothing her hair. It's enough to cover the Grand Sterling and the honeymoon in Bora Bora. You're young, Allison. You have a great job. You can just buy another house. But Tyler only gets one wedding. Chloe looked up from her phone, her eyes scanning me with a mix of pity and annoyance. Oh my God, Tyler! We picked out a cute little studio apartment for you, Allison. It's near the bus station. Super convenient for your work. They stood there, my mother, my brother, and his bride-to-be, looking at me like I was a minor inconvenience they had successfully managed. I looked at the power of attorney document on the counter. My signature was there, from a time when I was drowning in grief and trusted the only parent I had left. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange, icy calm began to settle over me, the kind I used when a structural load wasn't adding up on a blueprint. There was a flaw here. I just had to find it. I see, I said, my voice sounding far away. I guess I should go pack my things then. Diane beamed, stepping forward to hug me. I recoiled before she could touch me. That's my girl, she said, undeterred. I knew you would understand eventually. Family comes first. I turned and walked toward my office, hearing Chloe complain in the background that the lighting in the hallway was too yellow. They thought they had won. They thought I was the same broken girl who had signed that paper 3 years ago. They were about to find out exactly how much I had learned about foundations since then.
I stepped into my office and locked the door behind me. The click of the deadbolt was the most satisfying sound I'd heard all day. Outside in the hallway, I could hear Tyler's loud, obnoxious laugh and the sound of Chloe dragging a chair across the floor, already rearranging my life before I'd even meffed it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was the kind of adrenaline that comes when you're looking at a structural failure and you realize exactly where the crack started. I knelt beside my desk and pulled back the corner of the rug. Beneath it sat a small, fireproof floor safe. I punched in the code, my father's old badge number from the fire department. With a heavy thunk, the thick metal door swung open. Diane thought she was clever. She thought she was the only one who knew how to handle paperwork, but I was an architect. My entire career was built on the foundation of permits, titles, and legal compliance. I didn't just buy this house, I fortified it. I pulled out a thick blue folder. Inside was the paper trail Diane didn't know existed. When I bought the house back from the estate 3 years ago, my father's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had looked at me over his spectacles and said, "Allison, your mother is a woman of many impulses. If you're going to put your life savings into this dirt, make sure nobody can ever dig it up from under you." I flipped through the pages. There it was, the revocation of power of attorney. I had signed it 18 months ago when Diane first started borrowing money from my joint emergency account. I had filed it with the county clerk, effectively killing any legal authority she had over my affairs. But there was something even better. A transfer on death deed that had been converted into a sole ownership title with a specific clause. Any sale of the property required a dual authentication notary and my physical presence, specifically because of the house's historical status in our town. Diane hadn't sold my house. She had committed a massive, documented act of felony fraud. I sat on the floor, the cold blue folder against my knees. I could hear them in the kitchen again.
We should get the marble floors polished before the rehearsal dinner, Chloe was saying. It'll look so much better in the background of the photos. Mom, did you see the deposit hit? The wedding planner says if we don't pay the rest of the Sterling catering bill by Friday, we lose the date. Don't worry, Tyler. My mother's voice was like poisoned honey. The closing is in 2 weeks. The buyers are so eager they've already moved the rest of the cash into an escrow account. I'll just bypass the usual waiting period. The agent said he could make it happen. My blood turned to ice. She wasn't just stealing the house, she was dragging a real estate agent and a pair of innocent buyers into a legal nightmare. I looked at the blue folder and then at my phone. I could call the police right now. I could walk out there and end this. But then I looked at the shadow of my mother moving past the frosted glass of my office door. If I stopped them now, they'd just find another way to bleed me dry. Diane would play the victim, Tyler would say he didn't know, they would walk away with a slap on the wrist and spend the rest of their lives blaming me for ruining the wedding. No, to fix a structure this rotten, you don't just patch the drywall, you let the whole thing collapse so you can clear the lot and start over. I stood up and smoothed my blonde hair, catching my reflection in the window. I looked calm, I looked defeated. I looked exactly like the daughter they expected me to be. I tucked the blue folder into my laptop bag and unlocked the door.
I walked out of my office, my laptop bag slung over my shoulder. I made sure to keep my head low, my shoulder-length blonde hair acting as a curtain to hide the cold focus in my eyes. Diane was in the dining room, already measuring the walls for some sort of floral installation Chloe had dreamed up. Tyler was leaning against the buffet, scrolling through a car dealership's website on his phone. "I've decided not to fight you," I said, my voice intentionally flat and weary. The room went silent. Diane's measuring tape snapped shut with a sharp crack. She looked at me, her face lighting up with a mixture of relief and predatory satisfaction. "Oh, Allison, I knew you'd come to your senses. It's for the family. It's for Tyler." "Right," I muttered. "I'll start packing the guest room and the office tonight, but I have a lot of work projects to finish. I'll be staying at a hotel until the closing. It's too hard to be here while people are poking through my things." "Of course, honey. Whatever makes it easier for you," Diane said, already turning back to her measurements. She didn't even ask where I was going. She didn't care. As long as I was out of the way of her golden boy's coronation, I was invisible. The next few days were a masterclass in entitlement. I watched from the sidelines as the house money, the massive deposit the buyers had put down, started flowing like water. Packages began arriving at the front door every hour. $500 shoes for Tyler, a designer veil for Chloe that cost more than my first car. I even saw a catering contract on the kitchen counter for a midnight lobster bar. They weren't just planning a wedding, they were staging a coup of luxury on a foundation of stolen equity. But while they were shopping, I was working. I sat in my hotel room, my blueprints pushed aside to make room for legal documents. I called Marcus, an old family friend and one of the sharpest real estate litigators in the state. "She did what?" Marcus's voice had boomed over the speakerphone. "Allison, that's not just a family dispute, that's a felony. The agent who processed that without your ID verification is going to lose his license, and your mother—" "I know," I told him, looking out the window at the city lights, "that I don't want to just stop it, Marcus. I want them to feel the full weight of the collapse. If I stop the sale now, the deposit goes back, and they just find another way to ruin me. I need the closing to happen. I need them to be standing at the finish line when the floor falls out." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You're your father's daughter. He always said you had a better head for structural integrity than anyone he'd ever met. You're looking for the point of total failure, aren't you?" "Exactly," I said. "I need you to be there for the final walkthrough, and I need a favor from the county clerk's office." By the end of the week, my house, my beautiful, restored home, looked like a staging ground. My furniture was shoved into the garage, replaced by rented velvet chairs and mood boards for the wedding. Diane had even taken down the photo of Dad from the mantel, replaced by a giant engagement portrait of Tyler and Chloe. Every time I walked in to retrieve more clothes, I felt a fresh sting of bile in my throat. But I kept my face neutral. I let them believe I was broken. "2 days until the big check, Allie," Tyler shouted as I passed him in the hall. He was wearing a new gold watch that caught the light. "Don't worry, I'll buy you a nice dinner once we're settled at the Sterling." I looked at the watch, then at him. "I'm sure you'll get exactly what's coming to you." He laughed, thinking I was being sentimental. He had no idea that the big check he was waiting for was actually an invitation to his own ruin. The day before the closing was a fever dream of excess. My house didn't smell like cedar oil and floor wax anymore. Now it smelled like expensive lilies and overpriced perfume. Huge floral arrangements for the rehearsal dinner had been delivered early, crowding the foyer like colorful, suffocating ghosts. I walked through the living room, my boots clicking on the floor that Chloe had insisted be polished until it was slippery. She was currently standing in the center of the room, directing 2 delivery men who were carrying in a tiered cake stand that looked like it belonged in a palace, not a craftsman home. "Careful!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls I had spent months stripping and staining. "That's vintage porcelain. If you chip it, it's coming out of your tip." I walked past them toward the kitchen. Diane was there, a bottle of expensive champagne already chilling in a silver bucket. She was wearing a new silk blouse, looking every bit the mother of the groom she'd always dreamed of being. "Allison, dear, you're just in time," she said, her eyes bright with a manic sort of greed. "The final walkthrough is tomorrow morning at 10. The agent says the buyers are bringing the certified check for the remaining balance. Once that's signed, Tyler's wedding account will be fully funded." "I'm sure he's thrilled," I said, reaching for a glass of water. My hand was steady, a stark contrast to the fluttering, nervous energy in the room. "Thrilled? He's ecstatic." Diane leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He even picked out a dress for me. $6,000, Allison. Can you imagine? I've never felt so taken care of." I took a slow sip of water, watching her. Taken care of. She had stolen my home, my security, and my father's legacy, and she felt taken care of because her son bought her a dress with my stolen equity. The irony was almost poetic. "Is the real estate agent coming alone?" I asked. "No, the Millers, the buyers, want to be there for the final handoff of the keys, and their lawyer, apparently. Some procedural nonsense." Diane waved a hand dismissively. "But it doesn't matter. The paperwork is already prepared. I just have to sign as your representative." "I'll be here too," I said. Diane frowned, the first flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Why? I told you it's easier if you're not here. It might get emotional." "I have some final things in the safe I need to remove," I lied easily, "and I want to make sure the house is handed over in the right condition. After all, I'm the one who did all the work on it." Diane sighed, a long, martyred sound. Fine, but stay in the background. Don't ruin this for Tyler with your long faces and your architect talk. This is a celebration. I left the house shortly after, the sound of popping champagne corks ringing in my ears. I drove to Marcus's office. We spent 2 hours going over the timeline. He had the injunction ready. He had the police on standby for a civil standby call. And, most importantly, he had the verified records from the county clerk. That night, I stayed in my hotel room, looking at the sold sign I'd seen in my mind every night for a week. I thought about the childhood memories Diane claimed to be honoring by selling the very walls that held them. I thought about the porch swing and the way Dad used to whistle while he worked in the garden. They thought they were selling a house. They didn't realize they were selling their relationship with me, and the price I was about to set was far higher than anything the Millers could pay. I brushed my hair, the blonde strands catching the light in the hotel mirror. I looked at the blue folder sitting on the nightstand. Tomorrow, I whispered to the empty room. Tomorrow, the foundation cracks. The morning of the closing was blindingly bright. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the foyer, illuminating the dust motes dancing between the massive floral pillars Chloe had installed. The house smelled like a funeral parlor, overpowering lilies and roses, meant to mask the rot underneath. I arrived at 9:55 a.m. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer that made me feel like the professional I was, my blonde hair tucked neatly behind my ears. I carried the blue folder against my side like a shield. The scene in the living room was a tableau of unearned victory. My mother sat at the mahogany dining table, her pen already out. Tyler stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, looking like a prince about to inherit a kingdom. Chloe was by the window, snapping photos of her new home for social media. The real estate agent, Mr. Vance, was spreading out the final closing documents. Beside him sat the buyers, the Millers. "Ah, Allison, you're here," Diane said, not looking up. "Please, find a corner to stand in. We're about to finalize the transfer." "Just waiting on the certified check," Tyler added, his foot tapping an impatient rhythm on my floor. "The caterer is literally on the phone waiting for the confirmation." Mr. Vance cleared his throat. "Everything is in order, Mrs. Diane. As the authorized power of attorney for Allison, you'll sign here, here, and here. And Mr. Miller, you have the check?" Mr. Miller, a gray-haired man who had been very quiet throughout the process, reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a check, but didn't hand it over yet. He looked at me, a quick, almost imperceptible nod passing between us. "Wait," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room's frantic energy like a cold blade. Diane's pen stopped a millimeter from the paper. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Allison, I told you, no scenes. This is legal, it's done, and it's for your brother." "It's definitely not legal, Mom," I said, walking slowly toward the table. I placed the blue folder directly over the closing documents, obscuring the signature line. "What are you doing?" Tyler snapped, stepping forward. "Get that junk out of the way. We're 10 minutes from the deadline." "The only thing you're 10 minutes away from, Tyler, is a very long conversation with a fraud investigator." I opened the folder. "Mr. Vance, I'd like you to look at the first document. It's a formal revocation of power of attorney filed with the county clerk 18 months ago. It nullifies any signature my mother tries to put on those papers." Mr. Vance's face went from professional to ghostly pale in 3 seconds. He grabbed the paper, his hands trembling. This was filed? "Along with this," I continued, sliding the next page out, "the sole ownership title and the transfer on death deed. This house has a dual authentication clause. Even with a valid POA, no sale can proceed without my physical presence, a second notary, and my personal ID verification. You bypassed all of it." "You're lying," Diane shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. "I have the paper. I have the right."
You had a piece of paper I canceled when you started stealing from my savings, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. But it gets worse. You took a deposit, a very large, non-refundable deposit, under false pretenses. That's felony wire fraud. Tyler let out a nervous, jagged laugh. So what? The money is already spent. You can't unpay the grand sterling. We'll fix the paperwork later. You didn't spend my money, Tyler, I said, finally looking him in the eye. And you didn't spend the Miller's money either. I turned to the buyers. Mr. Miller stood up, but he didn't look like a nervous home buyer anymore. He looked like what he actually was, my firm's senior legal consultant. The deposit you saw hit your account was a monitored transfer from a litigation escrow. As of 4 minutes ago, that account has been frozen by a court injunction. The money you've been spending for the last week, you've been spending a line of credit that was just revoked. Every check you've written to your florist, your caterer, and your dressmaker is going to bounce by noon today. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the one my father used to wind every Sunday. Chloe was the first to break. Wait, the wedding? The sterling? What do you mean the checks will bounce? I mean the party is over, I said. Diane looked at the blue folder, then at me, her face contorted into something unrecognizable, a mask of pure, ugly rage. You bitch, she whispered. You'd do this to your own mother? You'd ruin your brother's life over a house? I didn't ruin it, Mom, I said, picking up my folder. I just protected the foundation. You're the one who built a castle on a lie. I looked toward the front door. On cue, the heavy oak door opened. Marcus, my lawyer, walked in, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Mom, Tyler, I said, my heart cold and heavy. You have 10 minutes to get your things, and I suggest you call a lawyer. You're going to need one much more than you need a wedding planner.
The next hour was a frantic, ugly blur of designer labels and desperation. The police stood like statues in my foyer, their presence a silent countdown. Tyler was on his phone, his voice climbing into a frantic register as he tried to call the wedding coordinator, the florist, the jeweler, anyone who would listen. "What do you mean the check is flagged?" he yelled into the receiver, his face turning a blotchy, panicked red. "Check it again. It's a certified—" "No, don't hang up." Chloe was in the living room, frantically shoving her expensive skincare and silk robes into a suitcase that wouldn't close. The prominent socialite mask had completely disintegrated, leaving behind a terrified girl who realized her castle had just turned back into a pumpkin. Diane didn't pack. She just sat on the edge of the velvet sofa she had rented with my stolen money, staring at me. Her silence was more toxic than her screaming had ever been. "You think you've won," she said, her voice a low, jagged rasp. "But look at you, Allison. You're standing in a house full of ghosts, and you've traded your mother and your brother for a pile of bricks. You're going to be so alone." I didn't let the words sting. I had been alone the moment she decided my life was a currency she could spend on Tyler. "I'm not trading my family for bricks, Mom," I said, looking around at the beautiful, sturdy walls I had restored. "I'm trading a lie for the truth, and the truth is, this house was never yours to give, and I was never yours to use." The locksmith cleared his throat. "Time's up, folks. Let's move it to the sidewalk." I watched from the porch as they dragged their luggage down the steps. Tyler was still trying to argue with the officers, but his gold watch and designer tracksuit looked pathetic against the backdrop of a squad car. They piled into Diane's car, the one she'd been making me pay the insurance on, and drove away without a single backward glance. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was the silence of a structure that had finally been stabilized. I went back inside and began the purge. I ripped the "sold" sign out of the lawn and tossed it into the gutter.
I hauled the suffocating lilies and roses out to the curb, letting the fresh, rain-scented air rush through the open windows. I took down the giant portrait of Tyler and Chloe and found the small framed photo of Dad they had hidden in the back of the pantry. I wiped the dust off the glass and put him back on the mantel. In the photo, he was leaning against this very porch, his eyes crinkled with a smile. I felt a lump form in my throat, but for the first time in years, it wasn't a lump of grief. It was peace. The locksmith arrived an hour later. I stood on the porch, my shoulder-length blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun as he worked on the front door. Clack, slide, snap. He handed me a new set of heavy brass keys. They felt solid in my palm, the exact weight of a fresh start. "All set, miss," he tipped his cap. "Nobody's getting in here without your permission." "Thank you," I whispered. I walked inside and turned the deadbolt. The sound echoed through the house, a final, definitive click. The foundation was solid. The load-bearing walls were strong. I walked into the kitchen, the scent of cedar oil and old wax beginning to return, and started to plan my next renovation. I wasn't just building a house anymore. I was building a life where I was the only one holding the keys.